The obsidian hull of the Hollow's lead vessel did not drift. It loomed like a tear in the fabric of the universe. Then, the Terran cruiser Aries shrieked, its secondary thrusters hemorrhaging blue fire as it accelerated. Metal screamed against the void, a collision course set for the very heart of the darkness. The silence of the bridge was absolute as the distance closed to a single kilometer. If you want to see how a debt of 12 millennia is paid in full, subscribe to the Chronicle. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath before the fire. 12,000 years ago, Elder Calith's ancestors had not looked at the primitive inhabitants of the third planet as subjects, but as a project. They had left behind the star gifts, genetic keys and subtle nudges, buried deep within the red clay. Calith stood now on the observation spire of Ethelgard, her long, translucent fingers trembling against the cold glass. Above her, the sky was dying. Not the natural death of a fading sun, but the suffocating, oily smear of the Hollow. They moved between systems like a blight, consuming the light of every star they touched. Ethelgard was the last jewel in this sector, and its luster was failing. She turned away from the terminal, her robes sweeping against the dust of a balcony that hadn't seen a visitor in centuries. She descended into the subvaults, a place forbidden to her kind since the age of expansion. The air here was thick with the scent of static and ancient, recycled oxygen. In the center of the chamber sat a pedestal holding a jagged, unpolished river stone. It was a primitive thing, smoothed by water that had dried up on a world half a galaxy away before the first Ethelgardian ship ever broke orbit. To her people, it was a relic of a failed curiosity. To the creatures who had once held it, it had been a tool for survival. Calith's hand hovered over a recessed interface. Her people were pacifists by evolution, their minds attuned to the harmonies of the spheres, leaving them defenseless against the discordant hunger of the Hollow. She remembered the legends, the way her ancestors had found a species of bipedal hunters who fought with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. They were animals with sticks when we found them, she thought, her internal processor whirring with the weight of her choice. Now we are the monsters they need. She pressed the sequence. A dormant, ancient distress beacon, buried under the lunar crust of a distant moon called Selene, flared to life for the first time in 12,000 years. The response was not immediate, but the ripples were felt across the subspace frequencies. On Selene, Grand Admiral Vance did not look like a man who believed in ghosts, yet he stared at the readout with a gaze that could have cut through bulkhead plating. The beacon was transmitting a sequence that matched the deepest encrypted files in the Terran archives, the Stargifts protocols. Vance stood before the Terran Council, his dress uniform stiff, his hands clasped behind his back. The politicians argued about resources, about the cost of a war so far from their borders, and the risk of engaging an entity as absolute as the Hollow. "They gave us the fire," Vance said, his voice a low rumble that silenced the chamber. 12 millennia is a long time to hold a grudge, but it's a heartbeat for a debt of blood. They didn't come for the resources or the glory. They came because they remembered us when we were nothing. The vote for total mobilization passed not out of logic, but out of a primal, inherited gratitude. The Terran war machine, a beast of iron and fusion, began to stir. The transition from peace to a state of total war was a spectacle that Calith watched through the long-range sensors of the archive. She saw the signatures of 600 ships tearing through the veil of hyperspace. They did not arrive with the grace of her people's shimmering craft. They arrived with the violent displacement of hammers hitting an anvil. As the first Terran ships formed a jagged steel wall between Ethelgard and the advancing shadows, the sheer scale of the commitment became clear. Subscribe to witness the moment the hunted became the hunters. The void was about to burn. The Terrans did not wait for the Hollow to strike first. They moved with a predatory velocity, launching kinetic asteroid strikes that turned the environment itself into a weapon. Calith watched the tactical displays, her mind struggling to grasp the Death World tactics. The humans weren't just defending, they were dismantling. The Ethelgardian sensors sang with a dissonance Calith had never recorded, the sound of physics being treated as a suggestion rather than a law. The Terran fleet did not glide. It punched. They utilized mass driver slugs that hit with the weight of small moons, and when the hollow's shifting geometry tried to phase through the kinetic impact, the humans detonated localized gravity wells to drag them back into the path of the iron. Kalith watched the tactical overlay from her spire, her secondary hearts rhythmic and heavy. The hollow had always been an inevitability, a silent tide that erased civilizations without a word. But the humans were loud. They broadcasted wide-spectrum white noise to jam the entity's collective consciousness, filling the vacuum with the defiant roar of a species that had learned to thrive on a world that tried to kill them every day. The battle shifted toward the hollow's central node, a structure that defied the eye, appearing as a knot of frozen shadows. It was here that the Aries made its final, lonely sprint. The cruiser was a jagged shard of scarred titanium, its hull glowing dull red from atmospheric friction it had endured 3 systems ago. Kalith's breath hitched. She saw the Aries ignore the swarming interceptors, its shields flickering and failing as it surged toward the obsidian heart. The Terrans weren't fighting for a planet anymore. They were fighting for the memory of a gift. They were the pack, and their alpha had been threatened. Subscribe to the archive to see which legends survive the fire. The end of the silence is only a heartbeat away. The Aries did not fire its main cannons. It didn't need to. Every ounce of its fusion core was diverted to the thrusters, turning the ship itself into a relativistic bullet. The bridge of the Aries would have been a chaotic symphony of alarms, but in the silence of the void, it was just a streak of light. Then came the moment Kalith had glimpsed in her calculations. The battered cruiser ignited its secondary thrusters and rammed the obsidian heart of the hollow's lead vessel, turning the void into a blinding white tomb. The explosion was not just fire. It was a psychic shockwave. As the central node shattered, the collective consciousness of the hollow didn't just break. It screamed and retreated. The shadows that had suffocated Ethelgard's sons began to dissipate, drifting away like smoke in a gale. Kalith stood on the balcony as the first true dawn in months broke over the spires of her city. The Terran fleet remained. They did not demand tribute. They did not plant flags. Instead, heavy transport craft began to descend, carrying atmospheric stabilizers and medical supplies. She walked down to the landing pads, her feet crunching on the soot-covered stone. A Terran soldier stood by a crate, his armor scorched, his visor retracted to reveal a face lined with exhaustion and a strange, quiet pride. In his hand, he tossed a small, smoothed river stone, the same primitive tool Kalith had seen in the archives. He caught the stone and looked at the elder, a small, tired smile touching his lips. He explained that they hadn't forgotten the first lesson his people had ever learned. When someone gives you the means to survive, you make sure they survive to see what you've become. He looked at the sky, where the massive silhouettes of the Terran warships still stood guard, and remarked that they'd simply moved from throwing pebbles to throwing planets. Kalith reached out, her cool fingers touching the warm, rough surface of the stone. The debt was settled, but the bond was just beginning. She realized then that the galaxy was no longer a cold, empty place of fading stars. It was a neighborhood, guarded by the long, fierce memory of Terra. The stone sat on her mantle for 100 years, a reminder that the smallest spark can eventually light the way home. How long would you wait to repay a favor that changed your entire future? Subscribe to hear the next chronicle of the stars tomorrow.